very important. We emphasize this time after time after time. Britain is not a nation of immigrants. Britain was not built by immigrants, unless you count the Irish navvies of the last century, when, of course, Ireland was part of the United Kingdom. Very important, very important we say that. That yes, if you go back far enough to the days of the Roman invasion, to the days of the Danish invasion, the Anglo-Saxon invasion, the Norman invasion, that is 1,000 years ago. It's also paralleled in every other European country. If we even Italy, North Italy is Lombardy. The Lombards were a Germanic tribe invading the Roman Empire. France is, of course, used to be called Gaul. It used to be a Celtic nation before it was conquered by Rome. Then it's invaded by, again, wide selections, that's funny way to describe marauding tribes of German warriors, the Franks being the most important, which is why it's called Francia or France. So all European countries with the breakup of the Roman Empire experience, even Spain,
Mhm.
some form or another of northern Germanic invasion. Now, this does not mean that in any sense that the people that result from that are any less indigenous than anywhere else in the world. And
Uh-huh.
it's a point, of course, with this, as it were, denial, this absurd, preposterous denial of the authenticity and the rootedness of Western civilization by the fashionable movements in universities and the whole critical race theory and whatever, that we have absolutely forgotten. Our population, in terms of its genetic, if you like to talk about its genetic origins, is astonishingly stable. The numbers of Romans, of even Anglo-Saxons, Danes, Normans is relatively tiny. Many people of these islands go back to the Bronze Age. There have been really interesting DNA tests. We are an indigenous people with the admixture, and of course the product of this extraordinary accretive culture from the Norman conquest, the addition of a French culture onto a Germanic people, and the result, wonderful fusion of the English language. But that does not mean we're a nation of immigrants. Even the admixtures of Protestants from the Netherlands in the 16th century and Protestants from France in the 18th century, the so-called Huguenots, people very similar to us, sharing a religion, welcomed by the official establishment as refugees, triggered enormous problems, really serious debates over citizenship. So what we've got to do, we've got to realize that the change in the composition of our population since the 1960s gradually and accelerating with the catastrophe of the Boris wave from 2019 is unlike anything else in all our experience. And of course, with absolutely infinite radical differences. Since the Romans, everybody who came here one way or another was, as it were, part of the northern European landmass. And since the Norman conquest, everybody, well, yes, that would be right. Since the Norman conquest, all were Christian, one form or another. There's now something radically, utterly different. We are run increasingly not by politicians, but by people who regard themselves as superior experts, who look down on the rest of us as the old-fashioned arrogant surgeon did on a rather stupid patient. Simply somebody, as it were, either to be soft-soaped or to be brutally experimented upon. And that's exactly what has happened. And what there is happening, of course, is a response, is a reaction. And the phenomena you were talking about, the protests outside the hotels, the extraordinary outbreak of flag waving, something that is, one constantly says, is not terribly English. You deployed flags for occasions of ceremony, usually royal ceremony. Because remember, one of the other things that is an extraordinary accompaniment of this strange shift in the literal composition of the body politic is the long withdrawing roar of the monarchy. When I was a boy, the central core of British identity, as opposed to all our constituent nations, England, France, so what am I I really am getting confused in my own historical period. England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland. And your British identity, insofar as you thought about it at all, was the loyalty to the crown. That was how it was defined. The centrality of the crown in everyday experience, the playing of the national anthem at the end of every theatre performance, every cinema performance, the standing for it, the extraordinarily important role of the Church of England as either the Tory party at prayer, or you could describe it as English Shinto, the English worshipping themselves through the position of the King Emperor, all gone. And instead, these new elites decided they would impose new values that apparently were held together by these mysterious things called British values. And when you examine their British values, all newly minted as part of this gigantic reinvention of the British state. Because again, Brendan, we've experienced something totally extraordinary. We've experienced a slow burn revolution since 1997, in which you've reinvented not simply the structure of the state, the great Blairite transformation, in which you distributed power from elected politicians, that's to say, people like that you and me can remove, to this body of experts, the staff of the quangos, the civil service, and above all, a newly intensely politicized judiciary, delivering, as we all know, I'm afraid, two-tier justice. And this isn't just a term of abuse, it's actually written into human rights law. This is what we forget. What's going on is legally entrenched. And the great proponent of human rights law, Tom Bingham, Lord Bingham, actually spills the beans in a lecture in Australia when he says quite explicit, human rights law is anti-democratic. It's counter-majoritarian. It's deliberately designed to protect these minorities, and he lists them, to protect minorities against the majority, and he lists them, the mentally ill, the Roma. Well, look, you're beginning to sound like a list of the more absurd decisions of the courts. I mean, starting with Ruda Cabana and Kalokani, of course, who should have been in secure mental hospitals from the age of about 10. Now, what you're talking about is the reaction. The reaction is similarly, what I worry, profoundly un-English. Because what are you doing when you're posting these flags everywhere? Where in the British Isles, until recently, was the only place that you would have found that? Where?
Northern Ireland?
Yes, Ulster.
Yeah.
Ulster. I was there earlier this year, and I was last in Ulster, last actually as a tourist in Ulster. It sounds an extraordinary thing, at the very beginning of the Troubles in 1972. And what I hadn't realised, because of course one gets very little serious news from Northern Ireland, was that the Troubles hadn't really gone away. They'd just been frozen. And what you have there is sectarian areas where the Union Jack is flown, or areas where the Irish tricolour is flown, areas where one set of gangsters dominate or another set of gangsters dominate. And what terrifies me is that what was peculiar, what was characteristic, what was the grounds that this extraordinary, stable Anglo-British state created was one where the individual mattered. We suppressed groups, we suppressed clans, we suppressed, of course, we were profoundly individualistic and fascinatingly divided society, along with other things that held us together, like clubs and trade unions and all sorts of things. But what we were not, we were not divided into clans. And the whole business of what happens in Scotland after the 45 is the deliberate destruction of clanism. and its absorption instead into the British Army with the Highland regiments and all that sort of thing. The English state in particular, been profoundly aggressive. The reason that we are able to enjoy individual rights of justice, individual rights at law, is the destruction of clans. But what we've done, we've imported, I'm afraid, clans that many of the things that have created this outrage that you're talking about, the protests outside hotels and so on, they are in response to the grooming gangs. But the problem with the grooming gangs, they're not gangs, Brendan. They behave like gangs. They are clans. They're groups of relations. They're fathers, brothers, uncles, first cousins, second cousins, third cousins, because these are communities that practice cousin marriage, which is why, of course, they're called communities, which is why they've got their community leaders. And, of course, what the British state has done is already, by its implicit acknowledgement of them, to begin the process of sectarianism that now largely symbolized either by the flying of the Pakistani flag, which has become very characteristic. You saw when it was Pakistani Independence Day, the complete takeover in certain parts of the country, or increasingly the use of the Palestinian flag. In other words, these so-called communities led the way in Ulsterization, in sectarianism. What we've seen, which was obviously on the cards, led by people like Tommy Robinson, as you would expect, is the beginning of the British response. The British working class are starting to behave in the same way. We're seeing the emergence of so-called community leaders within the British working class.